It was on this day in 1980 that Oscar Romero was killed. Some of you may remember that day, 44 years ago. It was headline news at the time. Archbishop Romero was then the Archbishop of San Salvador, and when his funeral was held, there were more than 250,000 people in attendance, the largest public gathering in the history of El Salvador. But when he died, he was in a far more private context. He was at a memorial service in a small chapel in a hospital in San Salvador. He just finished giving his homily, and he was walking in front of the altar when the assassin's bullet found him. He died later that evening. His killer has still never been identified, never been charged, but the reason he was killed was and is no mystery. Romero had been a particularly outspoken critic of the Salvadorian government's policies in the years leading up to his death. He had also criticized rebels who were using violence to try to topple the government. But this role of public protester didn't come naturally for Romero. By all accounts, when he became a bishop, he was a bookish, even traditionalist cleric. But it was in listening to the stories of the poor, especially the rural poor, the campesinos, listening to them that he began to see that he needed to speak out and speak up against the repressive actions of his own government. Near the end of his life, you may know that at his homilies, he became famous for reading the names of those who had been disappeared and murdered. His homilies were not simply broadcast, as ours are, to the people of one parish. They were broadcast by radio to the entire country. And it's estimated that at the time of his death, a majority of the country was listening to his homilies. On the day before he died, he was particularly explicit in his call for the government militias to lay down their weapons. The next day, someone came to silence him. But there's an irony there. As a recent blockbuster film put it, killing prophets only makes them stronger. Romero's voice was no longer able to be heard on the radio waves, and yet his death said something that his life never could. Christians have a long history of listening to these voices, of listening to the martyrs or witnesses, as having something to say that we can't hear anywhere else. They are witnesses that the way of following Jesus is costly, and yet it is on the other side of suffering that we find healing. Well, here in Canada, here in Toronto, here in Forest Hill, we are, thank God, not much in danger of martyrdom. We live in relative comfort, and we practice our faith in relative safety. But in this holiest of weeks, we are brought face to face with pain, the painful story that is at the heart of our faith. We heard it read just now, and we'll hear it read again on Good Friday. We find that it opens us up to pain, to at least two kinds of pain. There is, on the one hand, the pain of watching this man suffer, the pain of watching him be betrayed and abandoned by his friends, and finally the pain of watching a man unjustly killed. But the second kind of pain is worse. It's the pain of recognition, realizing that those words the cruel crowd says have an echo in words that we've said. It's the pain of remembering having hurt someone simply because we could. It's the pain of realizing that what Peter says about Jesus, "I never knew the man," has an echo in words we've said. The Passion stories won't let us hide from pain. They open up old wounds. And Christians are sometimes accused of relishing pain, of enjoying the feelings of guilt associated with this story. It's true that if you look at Holy Week, you could see why this charge has some depth. Is this simply a kind of masochism, a way of relishing the worst parts of being human? But I think this charge gets it precisely backward. Holy Week asks us to open up to pain, not because pain is good, but because that is how healing comes. Archbishop Romero, in one of his sermons, put it this way: there are many things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. Romero was summarizing a long strand of Christian reflection that sees suffering as a place in which God can meet us. The pain of recognition, of realizing our sinful nature, is precisely how God comes to heal us. And so Romero may be a good guide for these days ahead as we journey with Jesus to the cross, to the tomb, and finally to what comes after. Romero shows in his own life what can be done with a life that is opened up to pain, a life that finally is healed, even in dying. Earlier this year, at the seminary I attended, there was a significant service. It brought together clergy from all kinds of traditions. And the focal point of this service was a remembrance of Romero. That altar frontal that you see up here had an analog in the little chapel that Romero was celebrating at when he died. And a little scrap of that altar linen was taken from the chapel after he died. It was marked with Romero's blood. And the service at the seminary I attended took that scrap and installed it inside the altar of the chapel. Now, every time the Eucharist is celebrated, those there have a tangible reminder both of the cost of following Christ and also the potential reward of a life lived faithfully like Romero's. A prayer that's often prayed for tomorrow goes like this: grant that we, walking in the way of the cross, may find it none other than the way of life and peace. As you walk this week, remember that you walk in the company of saints and martyrs, together with Christ, until we come to Easter. Amen.